back to the Necropolis AD show, NADS for short. So you're here with the NADS. And today we got a really interesting episode for you. We have Keith Preston from Attack the System, author of many books on anarchism. He's an anarcho-pluralist, which is, he kind of pisses off everybody. If you're on the right, he'll piss you off. If you're on the left, he'll piss you off too. So he's very forthright in being anti-authoritarian, and whatever that means. It could be, a totalitarian humanism on the left, or it could be monarchism on the right. So Keith, thank you very much for joining today.
Glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Jason.
Yes, sir. Always great chatting with you. And we also have Bret Stephens, a monarchist from America.org, deathknell.org, author of Nihilism, which I actually looked up Nihilism the other day, and it's actually on Manticore Press now. I thought the original pressing was on Newman Books, but you can get it from Manticore Press, that Nihilism. But thank you, Sodomizer, Bret Stephens, for joining today.
Hey, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm actually really excited for this episode. I hardly have any notes, but I've chatted with you guys. More Bret Stephens than Keith here, but still, my interactions with Keith have been fucking fantastic. I actually wrote some song lyrics about that Platonist philosopher Celsus, or Celsus, however you pronounce that, his views on early Christianity, and a lot of great stuff there. And it was actually Keith who mentioned him on social media, and I looked him up. I'm like, wow, this guy's legit Platonist, anti-Christian. Wow, very cool. But so I know your political philosophies are quite different, but what I view you both share is that you're both fervently against democracy. So I'm just going to say it right now. This conversation is going to be a big RIP to democracy. And my views on democracy, I share with both of you, honestly. I don't think it fucking works in big populations. I took a political philosophy last semester, and there was a political science PhD student. He was also criticizing democracy, saying that it's not meant for fucking huge populations. Plus, how our two-party systems kind of dominated the show. Like George Washington did not want parties to form. He thought people would be elected to office based on their own merits and character and all that, which obviously does not happen anymore. But let's start out with some anti-democratic sentiments. I'll start with you, Keith Preston. What's your main issue of democracy?
Well, I guess the first problem I would have with democracy as it's defined in the modern world is that it simply doesn't exist. It's an illusion. As you were mentioning, if you go back and you look at all of the great political theorists from antiquity and the Middle Ages and the early modern period, even into the modern era, almost no serious political thinker believed mass democracy was possible. In the ancient world, democracy was often practiced on a more localized level, usually within fairly select groups that were fairly exclusionary. Jean-Jacques Rousseau probably comes the closest to being a theorist of mass democracy in the modern period. And even he thought democracy was only possible at the local level, which mirrors the thought of the Greeks and medieval thinkers and all of that. The founding fathers of the United States didn't believe in mass democracy either. What they believed in was sort of a Roman-style republic where you might have an Athenian-style local democracy. At least that's more the Jeffersonian vision. We can argue about some of the others. Hamilton actually wanted an American monarchy, and the presidency was sort of a compromise between the two. So in practice, mass democracy, as it's thought of in the modern world, doesn't work. I guess I have to qualify that by saying we have to first define what we mean by working, but it doesn't produce its stated goals. And that is popular participation and government of the people and by the people. In practice, modern mass democracy is simply an oligarchy. And that's going to be true of any kind of organization of any size. Any kind of organization of any size is going to be an oligarchy. And In modern liberal democracy, what you have is a capitalist oligarchy. You have a ruling class of those who control the economic institutions, the industries and financial institutions and technologies, and those tend to dominate the state. That's not to say the state doesn't have interest of its own. I'm not a Marxist. The Marxists tend to interpret the state merely as an instrument of class power. I don't really agree with that. I agree more with Bakunin, the idea that the state has its own interests over and above that of any particular class. But it's also true that modern mass democracy tends to be a plutocracy of oligarchic financial and commercial interests. And then in after the managerial revolution of the 20th century, we also start to see the role of mass organizations of a cultural nature. We start to see the role of the mass media, the educational system, and all of these other kinds of institutional entities that govern modern life. The managerial bureaucracies that James Burnham discussed way back in the 1940s. So we have this kind of hybrid, plutocratic, statist, managerial system that tends to control modern societies of the type we're familiar with. And there's nothing democratic about any of that. The mainstream social scientists will typically endorse what's called power elite theory, which is an idea that a sociologist named C. Wright Mills came up with back in the 1950s. He was a leftist, sort of Marxist-leaning leftist, but he believed that modern societies like the United States are controlled by a power elite of elites within industry, business, government, military. And I think we certainly have to add to that cultural institutions, particularly the media. And most modern social scientists will at least tacitly endorse Mills's analysis with varying degrees of intensity. And it can be argued, like a lot of modern social scientists argue, that we may have something approximating democracy, say on a local level, when we have referendums on, whether to float a bond to build a new school or something in a county or town or city or whatever. So there's elements of democracy that exist in modern systems, but it's not democratic as a whole. It's plutocratic and it's managerial and statist, and in the case of the United States, imperialist.
Yeah, great points. Very, very steeped in that academic side of political philosophy and sociology, Mr. Preston. Great insights there, and I certainly agree that what democracy is not democracy. It's just morphed into what you said, pretty much the elite, the powerful, which is, you look at postmodernism, and postmodernism just focuses just on power structures. But it's kind of interesting in that regard that even the techie side, the tech bros are jumping in, like you had Musk being involved with the government and all of that. It's just the powerful is, it's kind of interesting wrapping your mind around that, how society naturally gets manipulated in a sense. And I know, Mr. Stevens, you're really big into capitalism. Are there limits to the capitalism? Like, obviously having a lot of poorly produced Chinese goods that, break down after a year or two is not really sustainable for the planet. But I feel that unbridled capitalism is like the tulip mania, where it's just, you have all these various bubbles popping up, and they eventually pop over and over and over, and it's not sustainable. Do you think there should be limits on capitalism, Mr. Sotomayor?
No. I think that the limits we're looking for are actually on government, and that capitalism will take care of itself. Consumerism came about only after we had the massive subsidies going out, and that enabled people to stop saving for retirement and therefore spend disposable income disposably, for lack of a better term. What makes our current system odious is that it's government run, government subsidized, and therefore there really aren't any consequences to bad spending of money. Once you have Social Security in place, people no longer care what they do with their paychecks because their retirement plan is guaranteed by government. Once you have medical insurance and even worse, free medical care in place, they're not even going to care about their health. We see this everywhere socialized medicine is tried. So I think the mixed economic system, which is the technical term for the system we have now, is what's responsible there. I would add to that, just this is sort of an eternal point, that capitalism isn't really a thing. It's just economics. It's just functional economics. It has always been with us. It's mathematical. It's Darwinian. It's intuitive. However, it is only an economic system, and a society is comprised of more than an economic system. There is Keith and I use different definitions of culture. He talks about cultural systems like media, and that doesn't compute in my world at all. Those are businesses. But I think it's very useful to have actual culture, meaning organic culture. And I think on top of that, you're going to have some kind of political system and legal system. And those are sort of enmeshed with each other and also enmeshed with whatever you're using for your economic system. For example, our current society is based on an egalitarian humanist outlook, and therefore it's exclusively distributive. It's involved in wealth redistribution to create equality so that we get to some mythical utopia someday, which is sort of a combination of the Christian ideal, the liberal ideal, and sort of remnants of the American classical liberal ideal. But the thing about that is that what we're looking at there is an attempt to engineer reality, where capitalism is really just a way to predict or to interpret, because you can't always predict, to interpret markets and to interpret incentives. And those are important because what your society decides its incentives are will be rewarded by the markets, and therefore you'll get more of them. This is why I say it's very important that we have culture on top, and culture is downstream of genetics, as we like to say, because that then determines what people will buy, and that's what keeps capitalism in line. For example, the French still buy croissants, even though they could get donuts a lot cheaper, and they're arguably kind of, it's more of a perfect junk food if that's what you're looking for. And I think when you have a strong culture, it keeps government in check and it keeps the markets in check. Obviously, because I'm a monarchist, I wish to abolish government, which is essentially bureaucracy and committees, and replace it with something less formalized based on the accountability of individuals and the quality of their decision making. This is the essence of aristocracy, which is that instead of having committees hide accountability, you have people take risks, do the best they can, and aim as high as they can, realizing that if you leave it to the popular vote or even popular opinion, most people want easy answers and are going to oppose anything that has long-term benefit because it will be harder. They want easy answers. The crowd gets together, they demand easy answers, and then they get it in the ass, good and hard, from the people who are appointed to administer this, usually by the bureaucracy in the form of politicians, because these people have been elected to implement the impossible. You say you want free healthcare, nothing is free. Therefore, you're going to get a simulacra of that, which is designed to defer costs such that it can deliver today at the expense of tomorrow. And this is the perpetual crisis of democracies and any other democratic system, any other popular system. If you leave it up to the crowd, you're going to get stupidity. And this is why people like myself are very invested in a hierarchy of ability, because this is the only way around having that herd wisdom, which is not really wisdom, dominate and lead you to short-term, quote-unquote, solutions which are destructive in the long term. So when we talk about capitalism and having limits on it, I don't think we can have limits on it without imposing undue costs on the population. But the correct thing we need to look for really is guidance to it. And I think that can only happen through culture. I don't think law can do it, and I don't think politics or ideology can do it. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you very much for elaborating on capitalism and that perhaps everything's more epiphenomenal from like the cultural side of a population. Would you agree with that?
Epiphenomenal, yes. If I understand your meaning correctly,
It's like a byproduct, like a capitalism. The capitalism of a certain population is epiphenomenal of its culture. Like it's a byproduct of its culture.
Well, yes, and what I call second and third order consequences, meaning that it's not entirely predictable from the outset what's going to happen, but you have to sort of let it calculate itself out, and you can't directly control it. I agree there wholeheartedly.
I see, Mr. Preston. I know with your anarcho-pluralism, there's some things that Mr. Stevens stated about, his ideal society would like resemble an aristocracy. Do you have any views on that from your point of view?
Well, we can use the term aristocracy broadly or narrowly. A lot of modern political theorists who talk about aristocracy are referring to what really I think ought to be called meritocracy, which is the idea that individuals rise and fall by their own merits, and then out of that comes a natural elite of people of superior merit. And when it comes to the question of how we define merit, that can mean any number of things. It can be merit of skills in various areas. It can be merit of character. It can be merit of intelligence, or perhaps a combination of these. Traditionally, an aristocracy was, I think, something different from that. It was a titled hereditary position where you had large land holdings and things like that were passed down through family dynasties. So it wasn't necessarily the case that an aristocrat was a natural elite, just like a monarch wasn't necessarily a natural elite. In some cultures, you might have an aristocrat or a monarch who was actually a drooling retard, but because of their hereditary position, they were able to retain that particular title, even if they may have had regents or others that were acting on their behalf. So I would make a distinction between an aristocrat and a meritocrat, I guess would be the term. I don't really see a problem with meritocracy. I think in any kind of system you would have and would need meritocracy. I don't believe in absolute egalitarianism in the way that some people seem to believe in it. For example, I've asked people with radically egalitarian views in the past, in a hospital, would you consult the janitor on how to operate on a patient, and if you would, I would say stay away from that hospital. But the counter argument to that is that there's a certain, natural elite of persons possessing particular skills that doesn't necessarily make them an elite in a more general sociocultural sense. It just means they're an elite within that particular function. But I don't know that older societies were organized as meritocracies. I think that traditional monarchies and traditional aristocracies were, essentially structured the same way as organized crime in many ways, where you have the systems of power that are passed down through family lines, sometimes maybe on the basis of merit and sometimes on the basis of nepotism and patronage, and with the latter perhaps being more common. So meritocracy, I would give a thumbs up to. Aristocracy in its traditional sense, not so much.
I see. So, Mr. Stevens, I know you're a big proponent of the aristocrats and monarchism in general. Do you want to elaborate on what your vision of monarchism is? Is it kind of like the ethnic side that Mr. Preston is stating, where just keeping the genes in power, no matter the cost, where even you might have someone intellectually disabled ruling a population? Do you want to elaborate on what your vision of monarchism is, Mr. Stevens?
Sure. We hear the thing about drooling retard kings a lot, and the fact is that under the monarchy, Europe rose, and under democracy, it has fallen. We should look at where these retard kings come from, and almost all of these cases are from the later era of the monarchies, when they were already under assault by democracy, and even more, had lost an awful lot of people in the various plagues and wars and stuff like that. So between those two things, they were very squeezed, and without that, they would have had more personnel, and it would have been easy to get rid of these retard kings, because you have multiple lines of inheritance. You have a family of the king itself, and then you've got other families that are lesser aristocrats who can rise up, your dukes and earls and stuff like that, in the sense of be promoted by sort of a social agreement among that group, an informal agreement. It's not like a formal system. What I like about it is that you have, first of all, you preserve inherited traits, and everything I've seen suggests that traits for ability are passed on unless something goes terribly wrong. I mean, if there's a birth defect, you're not going to get those traits. And that does happen in a certain percentage of the times. If you aggressively inbreed, as arguably the Habsburgs did at a certain point, you're going to have problems as well. But I think other than that, as a general rule, the aristocracy served Europe quite well because these traits are inherited. How you get an aristocracy is actually the opposite of organized crime. What happens is you have first families who are rewarded for great service to the nation, to the people. And this is usually in terms of battle, but it's also been things like guys who figured out irrigation, guys who figured out how to beat local epidemics. You're rewarded for excellent service, and then you are bred into an elite where your breeding partners are other people of high intelligence. Generally, your aristocrats are 125 IQ points and up, where the general population is much below that. And as a result, you get people of exceptional ability, keeping in mind that the ability they're being bred for and groomed for since birth, essentially, is leadership, which is a skill in itself. I mean, to use Keith's excellent example, the hospital, I was cracking up over this one. I mean, yeah, you go to the hospital, don't just find anybody to do your heart surgery. The janitor is probably not the right guy to do it. Neither is the bureaucrat, nor the security guard. You need someone who's actually got the skill, and the really great surgeons have some kind of skill that even education could not create. They have the right stuff inherently, innately. And so I think that leadership is the same way. Some people have it, some don't. It does run in family lines. People whose ancestors were good at leadership are much, much more likely to be good at leadership. And these are, I think, facts that we can't really dance around because we believe them in real life. I mean, we all know of people who are talented like their parents, and we know that in general, people don't have talents unless they have some kind of precursor for them. There's a certain level of intelligence required. There's a certain level of gumption. We could speak about intelligence and character being paired here, and I think there is a strong argument for that because, as we see evolutionarily, higher IQ populations behave differently than lower average IQ ones. And so what we're doing here with aristocracy is trying to conserve those traits and promote them. And there's a complicated but informal system of these different ownerships and how people are able to engineer paths to power based on how well they've done at previous real-world tasks. And I think this is where aristocracy differs strongly from meritocracy. The problem with meritocracy is you have to have some way to measure it. And there's only really one way that humans have come up with, and that involves schooling and testing. And I think this is a narrow field. It's much less complex than actual reality. And this gives you people who are generally incompetent beyond a few memorized functions. And we see this in the world today. I mean, I see a lot of people who've got, law degrees, science degrees, et cetera, and don't have a lick of common sense and are doing horribly destructive things because that's what the education taught them. So they're just, just like Kraftwerk says, we are the robots. They just keep following that precedent and plugging away, and you get terrible results, but no one's really paying attention. So I think when you get an organic system like monarchy, it opposes this by having a group, breeding population of high talent people. And then you have to have lesser aristocrats who manage that. So when you get an incompetent king, you can remove them. Where you run into problems is when you have too few aristocrats. And obviously the rising democratic sentiment that began about 1,000 years ago really, really took a chunk out of them, as did the Black Plague, as did the various invasions of Europe from Mongols and Muslims and others, and of course the Crusades. But I think that that's something that you can manage if you're more carefully oriented toward having a proliferation of aristocrats. And that was something that maybe the original aristocrats didn't do as well as they could have. I think it was a blind spot because they'd never dealt with societies as complicated as what they ran into. And the other problem, of course, is the eugenics problem, which is that if you create a society where people can make money by just having jobs and can survive, that enables people who are of lesser ability to proliferate, and they do. And at some point, you have masses clamoring for socialism. So it's good to have less formal systems that do not reward as many people for trivial things, but are very careful to reward people who've shown the ability to rise above the herd, take a leadership role, figure out a problem through analysis and creativity, a complex problem, a real world problem, and address it, because those are the people who are best equipped to handle unknown situations or ambiguous situations, where I don't think the people promoted by education and meritocracy really stand a chance. And this is controversial, of course, because no one wants to admit that we are our genes. And yet science tells us this is the case. We can argue all day long whether it's 50% heritable or 80% heritable and 20% not, as some of the hardliners say, or as people like me say, almost entirely heritable. But the fact is, we know it's a major influence, and so you have better results by paying attention to heritability. And the only reason you would go with a blind meritocracy where you test everybody and educate the hell out of them and waste 30 years of their life is if you had a religious belief that everyone was equal and therefore had equal potential. So it's not really popular in democratic societies, but if you want to get rid of democracy in your soul and your mind, you've got to get rid of that presumption of equality. And aristocracy is an important pointer in the opposite direction. It says that you reward the good, you remove the egregiously bad, and you leave everyone else alone, and you let nature do what it does best, which, like capitalism, is improve quality and reduce cost over time. So I think it's a very organic thing, and it's not going to make much sense to modern people.
I see. Yeah, something that just came to mind with monarchism, like what you've been expressing about, especially when you get into the genetic component of it, which I would imagine, what you've written about on America.org, that you believe diversity, is a farce, and that birds of a feather should stick together, essentially. But with that system, say, even if you have, like Japan is very ethnocentric, even if you have like a monarchy based around, ethnicity and culture, there's not really a social contract there. You're just bound to it. Whereas, like in the Lockean sense, that kind of democracy also borrows from, there's a social contract where if you hate it, you can leave it. If you're being oppressed, you can, resist. And I view pluralism, especially like in the like Hannah Arendt and all that, and I know Mr. Preston is an anarcho-pluralist. You have a social contract. You volunteer to be part of the individual society. Is that correct, Mr. Preston? Is that like the main issue with monarchism versus pluralism, is that one has a social contract and the other doesn't?
Well, not necessarily. The concept of a social contract can have multiple meanings. The idea of the social contract it's commonly used in political science, emerges out of the early modern period, of course, and it really begins with Hobbes. And Hobbes has this idea that the implicit social contract is that by accepting the benefits of civilization, you agree to live by the laws of the sovereign, and the idea of social contract, the way it's practiced in a country like the United States, is really Lockean. And the way I interpret John Locke is that I largely see him as the spokesman for the rising bourgeois class of that time period. In the early modern period, we start to see the beginnings of modern capitalism, when we start to see the rise of the bourgeoisie as a class, as a dominant class. And I think that the Cromwell Revolution really, in many ways, represents the original coming to power of this class. If we look at John Locke's actual ideas, for example, he's widely thought of as having been a proponent of religious toleration. But if you look at his actual views on that, he was not. He actually believed in religious toleration for the rival Protestant sects and for the Jews, but not for Catholics, not for atheists, not for pagans or Muslims or what Mohammedans, as they would have been called back then. So I tend to see the model of the social contract theory as simply something that represented the class interest of the rising bourgeoisie and the various ethnic and religious factions that comprised the bourgeoisie as it was in the early modern era. Now, when it comes to the issue of capitalism, Brett earlier mentioned, capitalism as he would define it. I'd probably have a somewhat different definition of capitalism, and that is business, commerce, trade, all of those things have existed since time immemorial. I don't really think that that's the same thing as capitalism. Capitalism is a system that I see having emerged during the early modern period, with having come out of the age of exploration and all of that, where the commercial economy becomes hegemonic within the society and then within the state itself. In pre-modern societies, in ancient and medieval societies, there was certainly a merchant class, but the merchant class did not rule society. It didn't rule the state in the same way that it does in modern societies to a large degree. In fact, if you go back and look at what a lot of the ancient and medieval philosophers had to say about the merchant class, being a merchant was considered to be something rather disreputable in many instances, the way a modern conservative middle class person might view, say, a pimp or a drug dealer or a pornographer or something like that. The view of merchants was very similar to the view that many people had, for example, of the Jews. In fact, the two were often intertwined. So the difference is that in modern systems, the merchant class actually dominates the state. Now, there are around the world states where the capitalist class per se is not necessarily hegemonic. For instance, if you look at the West, the United States, Europe, and other similar systems, we see a system where the commercial sector, the capitalist sector, dominates the state. That's a lot less true in places like, say, China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, even Russia to some degree. All of those places have capitalism. They have markets, they have commerce, they have trade, they have business people, they have private property, they have profit makers. They're not Stalinist command economies like, say, North Korea still is today. But in none of those systems is the commercial sector allowed to dominate the state in the same way that it is in the West. In the West, we have sort of a system of banking dictatorship or financial dictatorship. Like a lot of people talk about how we're in the process of moving towards a multipolar world. And I think that that's true on a geopolitical sense, but on an international sense, we're still under the rule of the unipolarity of international finance. And one reason why we see so much hostility to some of the Eastern countries or some of the global South countries is that the one thing those countries have in common is their opposition to the hegemony of Western finance. And in many ways, it's interesting. I was actually discussing this with a communist, a literal communist friend of mine a while back, where he was saying that the Chinese have developed a system that is essentially what fascism was supposed to be in theory. And in theory, fascism is supposed to be something where capitalism or the market may be allowed to exist, but it's still subordinated to a nationalist collectivist state. And that's largely what China's system is. They have something where the capitalist class exists, but it's not the ruling class proper. And in older pre-modern societies, you had something kind of like that. You did have sort of a proto-capitalist class, just in the sense of the merchant class and traders and all of that, but it was not the ruling class. And I see a conflict between the idea of capitalism and aristocracy and monarchy. It's certainly possible that we could have a monarchy, like, well, for example, Saudi Arabia. I mean, that's a monarchy. That's a traditional monarchy. But at the same time, they do have capitalism. But capitalism in their system is subordinated to the state and to the monarchy and to the religion and all of that. Even Russia's system of national capitalism, I think, more closely approximates that than any of the things we see in the West today. But as far as monarchies and aristocracies, I think a lot of those systems were based on conquest and plunder as much as on natural meritocracy or natural elites. If we look at the most pervasive systems like that from past cultures, we certainly see that that's true. We certainly see that a lot of the great empires from the past, which were royal empires, were largely based on conquest, plunder, and they often had the same problems that we see in modernity, in that they would enter a phase of decline and deterioration and decadence. I mean, we certainly see that in the late Roman period. That's the most well-known example of that. I do agree, though, with the issue of genetics. I lean towards a viewpoint that's sometimes called genopolitics, which is a branch of genetic theory that's new and controversial. But the idea there is that individuals are born with a certain genetic propensity for a particular personality structure and psychological wiring and all of that. And then how that is expressed will be perhaps culturally and socially determined. But one aspect of that is that individuals are predisposed to have a particular political and cultural and social and moral and philosophical outlook. Like I've often referred to different ideological currents as psychological tribes, because I think a lot of that kind of stuff represents the innate psychological wiring of particular individuals, which is largely genetically determined. I think that that's probably the case, at least. And when you extend that to population groups, that's probably true of population groups as well. For instance, I tend to think that the reason that Westerners tend to have the values and political systems and cultural frameworks that they do is largely rooted in the fact that they tend to originate from relatively cold climates that have access to water. And if you look at different population groups around the world, you see that, for example, people that live in cold climates near water tend to have the more cosmopolitan type societies, whereas people from warmer climates or places that are more landlocked tend to have more, I guess you could say, conservative in a broad sense type of societies.
Well, that's really interesting, because access to water here means travel. When you're talking about ship-based societies where they're nautical and they can interact with each other, we could see that as a type of openness that occurs. We could also see it as a type of indecision that occurs, because you're basically deferring a lot of your decisions to the commerce that's occurring between those nations. I can see the importance of that argument, and I do think genopolitics is something very important. There's been a number of research studies done on the nature of liberal and conservative mindsets and how these are pretty much genetic, and how people, it's not so much like you've got a Republican gene with a little donkey on it or whatever, Republicans are elephants. But anyway, it's not like your political outlook itself is determined by the gene, but it's more a sense of aesthetics and what you value. And so I think there is an argument that populations that are most unified there have the easiest chance of working together because there's less internal disagreement. This goes back, of course, to Plato's idea of the gold and silver races, which were not races in the modern sense, but sort of categories of people, where originally societies were based on people having agreement, working toward common goals, and having sort of a common feeling of a system of honor and of methods that allowed them to get there. And that over time, this went away. And then the next stage involved people essentially dividing up the property and being like, well, you do what you want on yours and I'll do what I want on mine. So it's sort of a form of entropy in itself, in that over time, as a society grows, it gets more complicated and it's harder to get that kind of agreement. I think about the Nordic Althing which was their local form of democracy, which would not really match up to our ideas of democracy at all, because first of all, it wasn't voting. You had a group of wise men who ruled your village essentially, and they made decisions based on talking them through and coming to agreement. Until they all agreed, nothing was done. And the point of that was naturally to check any kind of momentary impulses or, fads or trends or anything like that. And when you look at how democracy expresses itself, it's sort of the opposite of that thing. But when you look at how groups can come together on shared goals, you see how the all thing could work, because you have this fundamental polarity, is this direction in which society is moving. And so therefore you can make decisions based on, does this achieve that? Does this help achieve that? Or does it not? And I think that's the breakdown that you're looking at the core of all systems. What I think we learned from the Romans was that you can't fix that with more rules. You can't fix the fact that systems degrade by making the systems more complex and bigger. And this is where I sort of fall into the classical liberal/libertarian argument of, we really don't need big government. It needs to be as simple as possible, because only when it's simple can you spot and counteract decay and degradation, where when it gets complicated and multifaceted and sprawling, decay can occur anywhere and be unnoticed until it's truly metastasized. So there's sort of you hit on a number of really interesting points. One that I think we should look into is the fact that the rise of the middle class, the bourgeois middle class, is what deposed our aristocrats. And this was a consequence not of failure, but of success. Society got wealthy. The wealth passed on down to the shopkeepers. The shopkeepers then became important. And I know that during the Edwardian era, for example, in the books of Jane Austen, this is extensively discussed. They are appalled by the shopkeeper class. They see them as crass, and they see them as prone to short-term solutions. And I think that it's important to see the bourgeois mentality, which is that it's sort of the general idea of human convenience, that instead of aiming for long-term solutions, we should aim for whatever makes the audience happy. So we're back to democratism there. It's a form of democracy, just like commerce can be, just like popularity at your local hipster dive bar can be, or voting, obviously. But anyway, the point is that the bourgeois mentality infests when you succeed. And this is the real challenge. The Romans faced a major challenge in that as they succeeded, they had no choice but to further expand. And this fractured their sense of a shared goal. And what I would call that as sort of as a counterpoint to the social contract is the social compact, which is a general agreement of what the direction is. And I, of course, because I like organic things, I like informal things better. And I would say that the social contract, as visualized by those thinkers, is an adhesion contract, meaning you kind of have the option to sign up or get the hell out. And it doesn't really leave much room for what you need, which is a culture that can help you negotiate issues without getting to a binary, burn society to the ground or embrace it entirely and be a bootlicking tool. That's not much of an option, but that's what the social contract offers you.
Well, so, if I can chime in real quick, the social contract, not everyone can buy into it, because children, they're not entitled to the social contract. They're essentially the property of their parents. Even in the Locke system, children were essentially property. So that's one demographic. Children, they're stuck where they're at, and then once they're of age, then they can leave or whatnot, or if they disagree with the society that they're in. But yeah, it's not everyone can buy into the social contract, especially when we're talking about monarchism. Seems from the ethnic standpoint, even more so, I would say the children are just part of, you brought up Plato with the different souls of the metals. You have the gold, silver, and bronze, and the bronze would literally be the merchant class, which is the lowest in their caste system. But even in his society, the children are more like communal property, but they're still stuck. They had no agency of buying into the social contract. But sorry for stepping on you.
It's true. Children are basically property. Hippity hoppity, children are property. However, I think that just reflects their dependent status on their parents, that they're financially dependent and dependent for care. And that's really not going to change in any society. They're not, we can, slice and dice over the age of maturation, or whether there is even a fixed age for everybody of maturation, as I would argue. But the fact is that at some point there's a line between childhood and adulthood in every society where kids are sent off somewhat on their own. I mean, they're still obviously aided by their families, but it's understood that they're going to take their own path and find their own destiny. And I think that I can see that that's a problem for the social contract theorists, but it isn't for organic thinkers, because we tend to see the individual as not existing outside of a family, no matter what its age is, and that families don't exist outside of a tribe. Tribes don't exist outside of a broader ethnic and racial curtain, and that therefore there's this chain of identities that the individual has, and these really reflect where they belong. It's interesting because traditional societies had a caste system. Merchants, I think, were in India. They were the class known as Vaisya, which was a subset of your lowest, your worker classes. The Indians had a much more complex system than we did in the West, and I can't claim to understand it in depth, but I know that they drew little divisions based on profession and how important those professions were, and basically how much you could do unattended was sort of how their caste system works. It's kind of brilliant in its way, but when we're in the West, we just had three general castes. We had our leaders, was a very small group. We had our artisans and warriors, and then there was the group of workers who were the largest. But traditionalists say, as societies age, that group gets too large and clobbers the other two, and that's why you get really moronic thinking, because these are people who specialize in doing repetitive tasks and are not as good with thinking through things that they haven't seen before. And that's where you get that kind of problem with the social contract, I think, is that when you recognize the different abilities between people, whether it's children or lower castes, you're seeing that maybe the idea that everyone has consent or a duty to rebel or something like that doesn't really make sense, because they don't have the ability to make that decision. And that does sound a little bit elitist, but I think it's genetic reality and IQ reality, and it's something that any future society is going to have to tackle. I'm not saying that necessarily we want to be paternalistic, but if you know someone is not capable of making a decision, whether that's the social contract itself or giving them a task to do in life, it's really not kind to then ask them to make it and then have them fail at it. You want to have people making the decisions they can succeed at, so they have the best quality of life possible. That's all I can chip in there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I did kind of conflate the producers with merchants. I kind of just look at this like the kernel of the archetype of both and saw it as similar. But in Plato's Republic, those would actually be the producers who are the bronze souls. But yeah, a lot about how the merchant class is now the dominant class here. And something that I've noticed, what I learned about my first semester of grad school was the Zapatistas down in Mexico. They're like indigenous communists who broke away from Mexico and have their own communal communities there. And I think they're at war with the Mexican cartels, but that's also like they're reconnecting with their ethnic indigenous roots and have their own communities there. Mr. Preston, do you have any thoughts on the Zapatistas, especially in regard to breaking away from Western influence? I know the American experiment has been oppressively implemented down in Latin America, and the Zapatistas, for instance, are resisting that. Do they kind of work into your mold of pluralism of having their own like society, even though it is kind of ethnic because they're all connecting with their indigenous roots?
In a word, yes. Something like the Zapatistas are very much a model of what I call anarcho-pluralism. And that is, you have different types of groups and communities that are essentially breaking away from the global system and refusing to participate in it. Oh, we could debate about how independent they actually are. I mean, they're any breakaway separatist effort like that in the modern world is still submerged in the overall global system. It's just like you have groups that are comparable, say, in South Africa, there's the Orania community, which is an Afrikaner community, or in North America, you have groups like, say, the Amish or people like that. So you can find examples of this all over the world. In Syria, in the Rojava region, there's a similar group that's derivative of the PKK, which is it's. I mean, culturally, obviously, they're much different from the Zapatistas, but it's conceptually similar. It's sort of a communal, quasi-anarchistic movement. I'm not sure how well they're going to fare under the new Syrian regime that's led by a de facto Takfiri, but that this was something that emerged in Syria during the civil war. And we can find other examples of that around the world. The question is to what degree these can be successful prototypes for breaking out of the global system, and that remains to be seen. But yeah, the Zapatistas are a model of what I call anarcho-pluralism.
I see. Brett, being that the Zapatistas also have like ethnic indigenous component to their community, would you view that good in league with like how your vision of monarchism should be? Because I mean, I know it's not a perfect match or fit or anything like that, because what your lens is through more like the Western world, whereas the Zapatistas are trying to connect with their indigenous roots and be their own people again. But do you commend like them breaking away from the Western society and creating like their own communal little societies?
Well, the way I'd approach this is that I see that as natural, as an inevitable process. Diversity doesn't work. Mexico is diverse. You have Spanish Criollos, you have Mezclados, and you have Indios, who are the Mongolian immigrants who make up most of the so-called indigenous population. They're not going to get along. They have different needs. They've evolved for different purposes. I think it makes perfect sense that they set up their own local ethno communities. That, to me, is logical because it reflects their needs. This is an organic process where they're saying, what the rest of you are doing is not working for us, so we're going to find what works for us, and we're going to do it by first picking out people who are genetically like us, because we all understand each other. And that, this makes sense when you look at Mexico. You can see how even the Indian population is divided between Maya-descended and Aztec-descended groups in central Mexico versus southern Mexico, the Yucatan area. And they're all sort of pulling away. This is no different than what the Basques are doing, the Catalan, various groups in France. I mean, we forget oftentimes that World War I kicked off over divided ethnic groups on the peripheries of Eastern Europe and on the periphery of France and Germany, where there were sort of these hybrid groups who were going their own way. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this. The modern nation state was created in theory to protect the founding ethnic group, but in reality tended to become sort of a grab bag of ethnic groups. And you see this breaking down in places like Belgium even, where they've combined multiple groups who don't really have the same direction and same culture and same aesthetics and same sensibility of life, and therefore they're not getting along as well as they could. I always talk about the diversity problems that we saw in the former Yugoslavia or in Northern Ireland, where it's Scots versus Irish. But all of these reflect the same thing you're seeing in the Zapatistas, which is that people want to be with people like them, and this is the natural order of things. So once you stop trying to force them all to be democratic, they're going to go their own way. And this sort of dovetails into something I wanted to mention based on Keith's excellent comments, which is a question we should tackle, which is, what is the global system? And people have different conceptions of this. International finance, which is basically capitalism plus usury, plus international treaties that cause that to be enforced. I would say it's simply democracy. I would say that over the past 1,000 years, an idea has held sway. It was borrowed in part from Christianity, though I think it had an origin separate to that. and in part from Asiatic cultures that we came into contact with, but also it comes just naturally from human laziness. And that is the idea of individualism, that the individual is more important than the social order. Therefore, we don't have to agree on anything. And instead, we're going to have this kind of lottery of votes, which is the origin of democracy, was the lottery of people writing their names on oyster shells, and the one who was picked at random became the leader. We'd have this lottery of votes instead because we can't agree. So we'll fight it out. And it's like an adversarial legal system or a commercial system or something else. No one really gets what they need. And so when you say the Zapatistas are dropping out of the global system, what I translate that into, rightly or wrongly, is that they're saying, you know what, our interests are our own. Trump talks about America first. We're talking about Indios first, and we're going to stick to our tribe and do what's necessary for us to survive. And we're not going to get roped into what the rest of you need. And I think that's the breaking out of the global system there, is basically defying democracy and saying no matter what the group votes for, our local community has different needs, and we're going to express those however we have to. It's interesting that they're communist because there's only a few systems that allow strong leadership. There's monarchy, there's fascism, there's communism, and National Socialism, I guess, if we have to mention it, although at this point, National Socialism to me is like the iPhone, simply annoying. And I think when you're trying to be an ethnic group breaking out of the global democratic system and the global assumption that you should give up your interests in order to subsidize others and in order to get along with others and play nice with the committee, you're going to pick one of those because you're going to need to have strong leaders who channel the will of the people, which the people don't really know how to express. And in fact, most are ignorant of and would prefer short-term solutions instead. So I'm very glad to see them breaking away because I think it's natural. I think it's an inevitable process and a reasonable response to diversity and to democracy. And I wish them luck. I mean, I don't know what I'd do if I had to rule Mexico, because I think you have a terrible job with all these diversity swing votes trying to create interests that bring together all these groups. I was watching the TV show Bosch last night, and the wonderfully cynical black police chief says to someone, an Irish candidate potentially for mayor, says, you have to get all the three groups, black, brown, and white, or you have to get two of the three groups, black, brown, and white. But that's how this city's divided. And I think that's the type of politics you play in a diverse nation state. You're horse trading to keep the committee satisfied. And the committee is composed of these different ethnic groups expressing their own interests semi-clearly to the degree that they're still befuddled by democracy. So I think you're going to see more breakaway groups like the Zapatistas in the future.
Yeah, something that Keith mentioned was that the Zapatistas may fail, which there's already some fracturing going on and all that, but that's to be expected. And that kind of raises me to a question, like in the U.S., if we implemented anarcho-pluralism where there was mass pan-secessionism, what would stop like a country from China from invading us and conquering us, Keith?
Well, first of all, there's the question of what pan-secessionism or anarcho-pluralism would actually look like. And that's something that gets really confusing to a lot of people because a lot of left-wing critics of my work believe it's just a variation of fascism or something like that. And then others think that it's simply a variation of left-wing anarchism like Bakunin and all of that. And I'd say that traditional anarchism is certainly a major influence on my own thinking and perhaps a central influence. But in terms of what I call anarcho-pluralism or pan-secessionism, pan-secessionism is just a tactical model. It's not an ideology. I mean, it's comparable to something like, say, a general strike or something like that. But the way I think that states around the world are probably going to evolve or devolve in the future is something kind of like this. For instance, let's just take the United States. In the future, I think the United States is probably going to more closely resemble the European Union in the sense that it's basically just going to be a trade zone and a currency union and perhaps a military confederation like NATO, but it's not going to be anything where there's any kind of common cultural framework in the way that you define a nation state. For instance, Brett mentioned the example of France earlier, saying, "Well, the French are distinctive. They have their own language. They like croissants and things like that. That's culture." And the nation state model of government is somewhat culturally derived. It's the idea of unifying the state and culture in some ways. Or at least that was the original goal of nationalism. But I think increasingly states of the future, particularly in the West, and particularly in countries like the United States, are going to be more like what we see the European Union becoming, in this kind of overarching trade system with all of these cultures that are subordinated to it or contained within it in ways that are largely incompatible. And that's going to lead to a situation where modern states are increasingly like Mexico. In many ways, I think Mexico is probably a prototype for what future states are going to frequently look like. You're going to have something where you formally have this kind of modern, democratic, multicultural state. And Mexico's system is not that dissimilar to ours. It's an 18th, 19th century republic. They have their federation of states internally. We have 50, they have 31, but whatever. But I think we're going to see states fragmenting, and parallel to that is going to be the proliferation of failed states. Around the world, we're starting to see more and more failed states, or just places where the state never really took root to begin with. One major influence on a lot of my thinking is generational warfare theory, and particularly fourth generation warfare theory, which is about the idea of non-state actors supplanting states as hegemonic social institutions and social and political and cultural forces. So increasingly, I think we'll probably see the United States look a lot more like Mexico or maybe Latin America, with the same kind of fragmentations and class divisions and oafish, clownish leaders. I mean, we're certainly seeing plenty of that. And then out of that is going to come things like the Zapatistas. Or there's another community in Mexico called Chiron that's very similar, and it's very indigenous, ethnic based as well. There's going to become more things. More things like that are going to emerge as more and more people are trying to figure out a different way of doing things beyond the failing, crumbling system that they find themselves emerged in. Now, as far as how a system like that it would resist the influence or domination of foreign forces, I guess I would ultimately have to say, well, good luck. But I think that depends on whether a new global hegemon is able to emerge. And I'm not sure that's going to be the case, at least not for a while, because even though the West is in a state of decline, I'm not nearly as optimistic about places like China and Russia as some people are. I see a lot of people on the far right, it could be called, who see the Russia as the wave of the future, or I see a lot of communists who think that China perhaps is the way, the so-called tankies who think that the China will be a wave of the future. But the entire Northern Hemisphere has the same problem, and that is its shrinking demography. This is true in Russia and China and Japan and places like that as much as it is in Europe and North America, where you have an aging population and the rate of demographic replacement is not really what it needs to be socioeconomically sustainable indefinitely. So the entire Northern Hemisphere has this problem in a way that much of the Southern Hemisphere does not. The parts of the world where the population is actually growing and expanding tend to be places like the Middle East or Africa. And so it's quite likely that in the distant future, we're actually going to start to see the nations of the Northern Hemisphere move closer together, including those that were previously rival, in a common defense against the global South, as the global South rises, demographically, if nothing else. And as we see the proliferation of more and more failed states and more weak states, I think we're probably going to see increasing alliance of states against non-state actors. And non-state actors would be the kinds of things we're talking about. I mean, it could be other things as well, but certainly something like the Zapatistas or whatever is a non-state actor, and there are many, many other things that come under the banner of non-state actors. So I tend to think that's likely the trajectory we're going to see unfold throughout the 21st century into the 22nd century. We're going to see the weakening of states, more failed states, more fragmentation of states, as well as the demographic factors that are involved in that. But as to how a weak state would resist an external conqueror, I don't know. The Greeks had the Delian League. The Holy Roman Empire resisted the Ottomans. So we'll see.
Yeah, this is a very bleak picture that you just painted for us, Mr. Preston. Especially when you consider like America being like Mexico 2.0, just as this market state essentially being ruled by the merchant class, which is not sustainable. So I do think I'm a little enticed by Brett's monarchism because at least it gives people some kind of purpose. Brett, can you save us from our bleak future?
Well, it depends on who you mean by us. The fact is, I would separate states in the future, or I'm going to use Sam Huntington's term, civilizations, into two groups, the doomed and the not doomed. The monoethnic are the least likely to be doomed. The polyethnic are doomed. Mexico is doomed. It can't rule itself. It's headed for collapse. It entirely depends on American drug money to keep it running. When that goes away, if it goes away, or even if it's interrupted, Mexico is going to go away because it's too diverse to ever hold together as a state. When you have a giant population of Indios who are poor, and you have a few Spanish-derived people at the top, and the two basically hate each other, you get a French Revolution situation there. Eventually, the Indios rise up, they kill off their leaders, they assimilate those genetics to whatever degree they can. There's sort of a new hybrid middle class, but they never regain the competence of their origins, and so they become permanent poor. And this is what we're supposed to call the third world developing world now. And I admire the optimism of that. I think that's admirable. But really, the third world is the failed states, and they're doomed because they can't produce anything, because they do not have any focus on social institutions. There was a really interesting article that came out this last week, which defined third worldism as the belief that you should just be individualistic and not focus on maintaining any shared institutions. It's the tragedy of the commons writ large. And I think this is the problem with any individualistic society, especially Asia and the third world, that everyone is so interested in doing what benefits them that nobody's maintaining the things they share, including shared areas. So you end up with giant mounds of trash, dysfunctional institutions, corrupt governments, crime everywhere. And a society does not rise under those conditions. It subsists. And the dirty secret of the third world is that it's entirely dependent on the first world for its income and for its direction. And without that, it's going to collapse. This is why I say the BRICS are doomed. I don't see the global south rising and being a hegemon at any point. They're headed straight into the dustbin of history. And I think we're seeing that with Russia bungling a war in Ukraine that they should have easily won if they were semi-functional. There's plenty of examples of this. China, which I agree with Keith, is sort of like a hybrid state, although I think it's closer to National Socialism than fascism per se, has not really demonstrated any exceptional leadership. It's just expanding for expansion's sake, both militarily and economically. And if the West decides to do the sensible thing and consciously decouple from that economy, China's going to collapse like it has in the past. It has never figured out civilization on a large scale. And in the same way, I think India has a better chance, but still faces some serious challenges and is very dependent on American money. And all the other, South Africa is completely doomed. Good luck to Brazil. They have a huge diversity problem there, too, and I don't think they're going to be able to master that one in any meaningful and fair way. And I think that when you look at these individualistic societies, especially the polyethnic ones, you're looking at places that are headed toward permanent failed state status. Now, that's not terrible. I mean, for a long time, Mexico was very happy. There were a few wealthy people. There were lots of peasants. They didn't really communicate with each other. They all just sort of did their own thing. there wasn't much money. There was no military to speak of. If China decided to invade, everyone would welcome them in and, give them a glass of horchata or something. They're not really fully functional as states, but that doesn't necessarily matter to the population all that much unless someone decides to invade them. And I think that when you look at the history of the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, and more importantly of Europe at the time of the Mongol invasions, you see why the modern state came about. Because unless you have people compelled to fight together, you are going to get rolled over by whatever Asiatic invaders come in. Even the Muslim invasions of Southern Europe, they were coming up through these failed states in Spain and in Italy, where the monarchs didn't really have control of all the territory. There were all these dissident groups. There were people on the fringes who had switching alliances. You had different ethnic groups competing with each other. That's how they got in. And so I think the modern state is a response to that. But I agree with Keith that it's weakening because I think it's gone too far. It's hyperextended itself through democracy and even more importantly through social benefits that it can't afford. And so all of these states are fragmenting. But again, I think we're dividing people into doomed and not doomed. If you want to be not doomed in the future, you become a monoethnic state that is self-sufficient, which means getting rid of the socialism, which means getting rid of big government in whatever form we define that, and having a somewhat Darwinian environment in which the most competent rise, which is what democracy suppresses and is why it self-destructs. And so when we look at the future, it almost branches into two directions. One way is to classical Europe and the other way is to modern Mexico. And you have to ask yourself, well, which one here is doomed and which one is not doomed? But when we're talking about modern states, we're looking at something that has evolved out of other previous forms. We mentioned the Holy Roman Empire. That was a theocracy, a theocratic empire. And that was one way of unifying groups. Huntington nods to this because he says civilizations are primarily formed of religious components, but there's an ethnic component to it as well and a cultural component. I, of course, take the other point of view, which is that ethnicity, culture, and religion are basically one and the same, or at least linked to a common root. And that's how people are going to separate. I see that the Basques and Zapatistas would agree with me. But there was also the era of city-states, and I think we could see a return to that to some degree. But I don't know if we're going to abandon the modern state model simply for the hypothetical that y'all bring up, which is what do you do when the Chinese invade if you're a whole bunch of little independent states or independent warring diversity groups or unassociated areas that don't have mutual defense contracts? You're going to get rolled over, just like Eastern Europe was by the Mongols, just like huge parts of Southern Europe were by the Muslims. And, we can talk about the Huns as well, but they had a similar issue of disunified, non-communicating states, tiny little states that could not oppose them. So I think we look at history, whether it's linear or cyclic, but I think we should look at it in terms of really scale and complexity, which tells us that as societies get prosperous and get bigger, they face different problems because they simply have more territory to cover and more people to cover. So you're going to need additional layers of either authority or agreements or treaties or whatever to manage this situation. And it's almost like this period of history is humanity adjusting to the fact that it can succeed, but once it does succeed, is it able to keep its test rockets from not exploding on the launch pad, metaphorically speaking? And as we look into this future, this 21st century, I think the dominant theme we've seen so far is one of ethnic separation. Diversity is not working for anyone. I don't think socialism is working for anyone either. And that is intrinsically tied to big government because you don't get big government without Tammany Hall style favor programs where you're giving benefits out to citizens and the bureaucrats can sort of, tip the scale or put a thumb on the scale periodically to help different people out. But I think those things are failing. I think democracy and socialism are not doing well. Diversity is not doing well. And so we're looking at a grand reshuffling where some states are going to get to this point of monoethnic self-sufficiency and relatively, let's just call it relatively capitalistic living. And others are going to keep trying the 20th century model and end up doomed. And it's going to, in the long term, I think it's going to have big consequences for our concept of the state itself, which, as I mentioned, is continually evolving as we face complexity, which is that this is where I have a lot of overlap with a lot of the traditional anarchists and naturalists who came before them, is that the more rules we make, the more methods we adopt, the more procedures we have, the more checklists we have, the more we try to manage every aspect of reality so that it's all equal and so that all turns out well, the more we degenerate because we're interrupting natural selection, but also because we're simply brainwashing people. Where do I agree with anarchists? It's that I think government and religious institutions have far too much influence in our daily lives, and that they're messing with people who aren't causing problems. For example, if some gay couple is living in a bungalow, and doing whatever the hell they do, it's not really a social issue to manage. There's not damage being done here, and I think that religious people find that offensive. In the same way, if there's some people living in ghettos who are permanently poor and they're not doing so well and they starve and die young, is that a social problem we need to manage? I would say no. I'd say we're looking at the process of nature, the not just natural selection, but the differentiation of groups. And some are, going to have a different type of life and a different destiny than others. And that's just how things are. I was talking with someone the other day, and we were shooting the shit about various stuff, and some bum wanders passed. Oh, wait, we're not supposed to call them bums. They're homeless people. They're unhoused. They're unpapered or some damn thing. But anyway, this guy was your typical bum. He's a combination of alcoholic, schizophrenic, and probably just criminal. He's probably just an extremely selfish person. I tend to think they're assholes based on experience. Most homeless people I know have engaged in extensive criminal behavior. But my friend was saying, well, society should do something for this person. And I was saying, no, he's chosen his destiny. He's happy doing what he's doing. What we want to do is keep him away from decent people. And what I'd do for him is cut the cost of his drugs and alcohol, so that he can follow his destiny as he should. We don't need to moralize. We definitely don't need to standardize everybody and enforce conformity. And I think that in the future, as people get away from that idea of government as the parent in loco parentis and start looking at societies as having an organic core, they're going to stop trying to manage every last detail. This is a means over ends approach that they take. They're going to stop trying to manage every last detail of everyone's life, and they're going to focus more on what the aristocrats did, which is that you reward people who do exceptionally good things. You make sure that anyone who's doing roughly the right thing is safe, and you remove people who are threats, and you leave everyone else alone. And that's actually a brilliant fusion, when you think about it, of anarchy and authoritarianism. So I think we're going to be leaving behind these ugly old 20th century definitions, which were basically occasioned by the French Revolution, itself possibly a product of the Magna Carta and the division 200 years before that, as the bourgeois rose and found alliances with certain local barons who realized that they could gain some power through the money and the power of the middle class. And we're sort of coming out of that historical arc, and we're looking at a different time. But again, I think that what we need to do now is just look at the doomed versus the non-doomed. I think the BRICS are doomed. I think the global south are doomed. I think the first world is going to form trading communities of the type that Keith mentions, probably more loosely than the EU, which has obviously gone way too far in so many dimensions and become this unstable bureaucracy that's absolutely insane. But I think we're going to form trading treaties, at least trading communities. And I think we're going to pull back from the third world. Automation is going to enable us to replace their labor. We're perhaps eventually going to get control of our union problem by removing legal protections for unions, which solves the problem. And we're going to go our own way, and I think that's going to leave the global south falling apart based on its own weight, especially since it's hopelessly overpopulated. And there's going to be people eating each other there, and we're just going to watch and think that's kind of cute. Speaking of overpopulation and reproduction rates, I actually think this is a spook. We don't need that many people to restart. The real question is people quality. You need people over 120 IQ points of good moral character, and you need to get them to have big families. And the way you do that is you stop taxing them. You either implement a flat tax or abolish the taxes and find some other way of raising revenue. But really, at this point, most of Western society runs on this model where all of us subsidize Mitt Romney's 47% who pay nothing. And I don't know what the actual number is, whether it's 47% or not. That's probably more complicated and more clinal, more a question of degrees, more spectral than we'd like to admit. But I think we're all based on this subsidy model, this socialist subsidy model, in the aim of achieving equality. And what I see happening in the 21st century is that we're going to admit that equality has failed, that it's a symbol and not a reality. And we're going to stop trying to fix this. And with that, the big state dies. And we're going to look at states with more decisive power, but less power over your everyday life, perhaps even leaving the state behind entirely and getting back to aristocratic systems, which in the long calculus work better than anything else.
Well, I know Keith probably has a lot of retorts. I know when you mentioned that cutting the cost of drugs for bums, he would probably agree with that because I've read some of his works in the past, but I do have a question before Keith responds. Brett, can you summarize Dick Cheney in one word?
Chode.
How about you, Keith? Dick Cheney, one word.
Asshole.
All right. So in college, when people ask what I am, if I'm conservative or progressive or liberal or Marxist or whatnot, I've been kind of just saying I'm an anarchist and I'm like Dick Cheney bad, and everyone just is kind of cool with me. But do you have anything to retort to what Mr. Sotomayor stated, Keith?
Yeah, well, the arguments that Brett makes are interesting, and his thinking actually reminds me very much of Hans Hermann Hoppe. Hans Hermann Hoppe, for those who aren't familiar with him, is an anarcho-capitalist, which is sort of a right-wing anarchist. And he fuses anarcho-capitalism of the type that people like Murray Rothbard developed with a more traditionalist monarchist critique of modernity and democracy that, in a way, I think is very similar to Erich von Kuehnelt-Leddihn or perhaps Eric Voegelin or perhaps a number of other anti-modernist thinkers. I actually wrote a book some years ago called Thinkers Against Modernity, and it's a profile of various intellectuals from the 19th and 20th century that were critics of modernity as modernity was developing and unfolding. I think I wrote about Nietzsche and Carl Schmitt, Evola, Hilaire Belloc, and some other figures like that. But I don't think it's entirely possible to predict the future. I mean, obviously, all of this is speculative, and there's probably going to be a lot of variables that neither one of us can really see that clearly that are going to end up making a difference. When it comes to comparing modern societies with pre-modern societies, I do think we can make some kind of analogies that indicate that the types of societies aren't necessarily as different as we may think. I mean, obviously, there's vast differences on a micro level and on an intermediary level. But I have a piece that I wrote that I posted on Substack some months ago where I'm trying to make a comparison between, say, modern America and a medieval country. And if we wanted to make that kind of comparison, we could say that, our version of royalty would be something like the presidency and the executive branch, even to the point of having these elite families, the Trumps, the Clintons, the Bushes, et cetera. Our version of the aristocracy or nobility might be something like the billionaire class, or perhaps these political dynasties, the Bushes, the Kennedys. Our version of the gentry and the merchant elites might be the upper middle class professionals or the Wall Street hedge fund managers or the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. Our version of the church, Brett mentioned culture early on, and my discussion of the media. I would see the institutions like the media and the universities and other similar cultural institutions as essentially being our version of the church, because the role of the church in a medieval society was to essentially define and disseminate the dominant cultural norms and values of the particular society, or what the Marxists call the superstructure. And the church in medieval times had the same role as, say, Islam in somewhere like Saudi Arabia. But if we look at societies like ours, who is it that really defines the norms of the culture? And it's the church still has peripheral influence, but the media and the universities and we could say social media and tech companies, I think those play as much of a role as anything else in terms of shaping the way people think and the value systems that people have, and like from the Frankfurt School from the left, there's this concept called the culture industry, which is the idea that modern capitalist institutions create their own demand for their products through the creation of culture. And that's largely what advertising is. Advertising is this idea, well, you've just got to have this particular brand of, toothpaste or whatever it is, something that would have never occurred to a person that they needed prior to being introduced to the idea. And then, of course, our version of the knights and military orders would be something like perhaps the military industrial complex, or maybe private firms like that, like Blackwater or whatever it's now called, Academy. And then our peasants and serfs might be, say, the working class and the gig economy, and our guilds and craftspeople might be unions and skilled tradespeople. So I guess my point with this is that it seems we have many of the same features of older societies being replicated in modern societies, and that the problems that we see in modern societies are not entirely dissimilar to what we saw in older societies. So it seems like that whatever model of society we prefer, we still have to face these same basic human problems. And I don't really see that going away. I'd be curious to know what Brett's opinion is of some of the remaining royal systems that exist around the world. And I don't mean the British royal family, like the Windsors. I mean, systems where royalty still has real power, like, for example, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, some of the Gulf states, because I've heard some folks with a monarchist sympathy say those systems really aren't nearly as bad as people in the West make them out to be. For example, I know Hans Hermann Hoppe is a fan of the United Arab Emirates. So I'd just be curious to hear Brett's thought on that.
It's a good question. I'm in an oil town, so a lot of people fly out there and report that they're very pleasant and very orderly. I have not been. I also have moral challenges trying to equivalate across cultural, ethnic, and racial lines, because what works for them may not work for my people. And I really don't feel like I should instruct other groups, because I think their destiny is their own. That being said, I think that there's a good chance that it will work there, especially given the crisis of democracies and theocracies in the region. Having a monarchy is a good way to mellow things out. Because it's informal, you're able to avoid making a whole lot of little rules and come in conflict with things, but you're also able to mediate conflict through basically social events. And I think this is what a lot of the aristocrats did in the past. We always talk about them marrying off their daughters, but it's a great way to ensure that there's going to be peace between two nations. If the queen in the nation that used to be attacking you is actually related to you. And I think that there's a possibility that these Middle Eastern monarchies are responding to a real need in the region, which is that when most of your voters will pick Islam, possibly a radical form of it, or some type of democracy that's aligned with the West and destined to fail, it's really good to have a mediating force like a monarchy that can take care of the minimal needs of government. I mean, I think one of the things that these countries have in common is we're not seeing them intervene much in international affairs. They're mostly focused on domestic prosperity and keeping order, which really, unless you have an ideological quest, is a sensible way to live. So that I apologize for how unexciting that is, but that's basically all I can offer there. I don't know too much about the Middle East, but I do wish them luck.
Another model I've heard some people bring up as as an alternative is Singapore. I know some people in nationalist or right wing, broadly defined circles who are big fans of Lee Kuan Yew. The problem I see with that is it's the same one. It's cultural in the sense that that's essentially a Confucian society. So I don't know how transportable that is to the West. In fact, we could say the same about China. Got some years ago when Deng Xiaoping was still the premier of China. One of the German chancellors, it was either Helmut Schmidt or Helmut Kohl, one of the Helmuts, told Deng Xiaoping that their system seemed more Confucian than communist, and supposedly Deng Xiaoping said, "Well, it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as long as it chases mice," or something like that.
Just to kind of chime in, Confucianism, that you have the government as part of your family, because of the warring states in China. Confucianism was kind of what was the solution, especially Neo-Confucianism, where first is your immediate family and all that, but in the hierarchy, the state is part of that. Like, this considered part of your family. That was just kind of stop everyone from the peasants from revolting and all that, because China was this constant succession of internal conflicts over and over and over, and Confucianism was kind of a response to that. But that's kind of interesting that someone equated modern China to Confucianism. I'm not sure. I've never been to China. I just have a Western perspective of what China is. I'm sure it's really different than how the news portrays it.
I'm sure most everything is.
Yeah, I don't trust the news. When you look at it as a business model, for them to make any money, they have to do a very surface treatment of anything they touch. When you're in, my first love was journalism, and when you're in that format, what you're doing is trying to keep, it's called the news for a reason. You're trying to present novelty all the time, and your production costs are incredibly expensive. Maybe in the 1950s, they could afford to send all these interesting guys like John le Carré out to do these research pieces and stuff like that, but not in the current media format. So it's probably unwise to consider their opinions on China as too much of reality, because they're probably just designed as a product to give people something easy to chew on.
Yeah, like the social credit thing they have over there. Like, I'm unsure how much of that is actually a thing, but here in the West, it seems like if you jaywalk, you could get, or if you just post a video on social media lambasting the CCP, you could lose like privileges to ride trains and all of that. But it's just my Western perspective. Of what I've heard and seen of China is probably not the true authentic China. But it's kind of interesting that Confucianism, like that, the social credit system would kind of work into Neo-Confucianism a little bit. If the government's part of your family, and keeping your family orderly is very, very important. Therefore, you want to have an orderly society and all that. And social credit would work into that. But anyway, I figure we can wrap up on a light question. We got into a lot of various theories. And this is actually like the first like actual political episode I've ever done on a podcast. So I appreciate you guys for your participation. But we were talking about Plato's noble lie with the different metal souls, like the gold, silver, and bronze. And what is the American noble lie? Like, some people say it's the American dream, is our noble lie, but it seems like democracy itself may be our noble lie. Keith, I'll start with you.
I'd say if I had to pick one thing, it would be the concept of American exceptionalism. I think that's rooted in the fact that we have such a deeply Protestant heritage. I mean, we're probably the most Protestant country there ever was. And if we look at our Puritan ancestry and all of that, we see this idea of America as a city on a hill, or the Augustinian city of God, or a modern version of the biblical promised land and that kind of thing. In fact, I think that's why the United States, in part, has such a close relationship with Zionism. I think that's something that culturally fed into that. But there's this idea of American exceptionalism that somehow it often gets to the point where it's almost like the laws of nature don't really apply to Americans. I've seen that in a lot of American exceptionalist rhetoric. I know back when George W. Bush was the president and the wars in Iraq and things like that were going on. Supposedly there was an official in the White House who said, well, we're the American empire and we create our own reality. And you mentioned Dick Cheney earlier. I think there's something he said around the same time where, about we're the force of creative destruction. But I think this kind of notion of American exceptionalism as some sort of utopian project that's immune to the general laws of history is probably our noble lie. I don't know how noble it is, but it's obviously not true.
Well, even Netanyahu recently said that America is the new Roman Empire. How about you, Mr. Sodomizer?
I completely agree with Keith. I think the utopian nature of equality that got inserted into America shortly after the Constitution was written is our noble lie, because it enables us to be morally pretentious and assume that what we're doing is right because we're advancing this ideology. And again, this ideology has overlap with Christianity, but it also came in because of our mixed ethnic origins, specifically the Irish immigration of the early 1800s. But, it's interesting. I was thinking, I got sidetracked by when you said, this is your first or one of your only politics podcasts. And I was thinking, we really aren't talking politics here. We're talking about how politics displaced philosophy. And I find it very interesting. I really enjoy hearing Keith's analysis and, getting sort of a greater depth on some of these concepts. But I think where monarchists and anarchists cross over, where we can find common ground, is we don't like the state. We don't like the means over ends micromanagement and managerial administrative state that is constantly trying to make bad into good, trying to force everyone to conform so we all seem to be good from the statistics, and trying to essentially socially engineer us into this utopian project that I don't know if it's Protestant in origin. I think it may have been covered under that, but I think it's basically diversity talking. I think diversity fractured America from the beginning, and it interrupted our ability to have culture, and we're still fighting that one out. But, it's interesting we mentioned the social credit score in China. This is something that I think a lot of people fear, not realizing that we have one here in America. It's just opt-in. Your social credit score here, if you don't think you have one, go apply to rent an apartment in a big city. They're going to ask for your credit information. They're going to do a background check on you. They may even ask to see your social media or something else. They're going to talk to your employer, so forth and so on. That's an opt-in social credit score. It may not be quite as simple as the Chinese one, where there's some number on a website that determines whether you eat, whether you get to eat 2 lizards that day or 1. But I think we have that, and I think that's how societies that are barely holding it together try to manage their people. And this is another type of that means over ends type thinking, where it's like, we don't need everybody to agree. We're just going to use scientific management to force them all to behave as if they agree. And if anyone becomes a dissident, we'll lop their head off or send them to the ghetto or something. But that's really where anarchists and monarchists, I think, are seeing clearly about the modern state, which is that I don't believe in good and evil, but there's something not healthy at the center of the modern state. And it's not just not healthy for us physically, but I think it's changing us psychologically. And it has gotten us away from any kind of naturalistic thinking, away from any kind of aspirational thinking. And I think it's fading in the 21st century, because I think people finally want something more out of life. I was talking with a guy the other day, and he's saying, well, it's simple why people aren't reproducing much. They don't want to have their kids be raised in this disaster of a society. And I think that's where we are in Democracy Incorporated at this point. It has had total power for a long time. It's implemented all of its grand plans, and everything has turned out badly, and it's all crashing at once. And so we are ready for a transition. And if the noble lie is, as I think Keith alluded, the city on a hill, that because we are morally good, we are going to dominate the world in a religious, political sense. I think the answer is actually to look more deeply into philosophy, as Plato would have done, as Socrates would have done, and say, well, why is that so? What's the cause-effect relationship? And when we break things down, I think we're going to figure out that we've been in a means over ends mentality for too long, where we're not questioning whether things like democracy and socialism and diversity are actually achieving what we claim they are on a symbolic level. And that's really the big split. And I think America is about to have to redefine itself, because we've done some things that haven't been so good. We've done, probably on the balance, mostly good. I don't know for sure. But there's some things that aren't good, and they're not good for us either. And so I think, we're entering a time of great reassessment where we're trying to figure out what we actually need as human beings. And so I think we're going to be leaving behind that noble lie, and I think it's going to happen more through changes in philosophy and culture than through politics itself.
I see. Any final thoughts, Mr. Preston?
Yeah, I do think that the culture that we're now in is very much in a transitional phase. I think that the ways of thinking that developed in the 20th century are fading, and I don't really know what's going to come next, other than just the things I've speculated about in the past. I think one big wild card is going to be the impact of technology. I think we still don't really know what the overall impact of that is going to be. Also, ecology. That's another thing as well. There are ecological problems that I think are going to be major social factors in the future. But other than that, I do think that we are perhaps in the Western world reaching a situation that's going to be somewhat analogous to the crisis of the late Middle Ages, or the problems of the late Roman Empire, or the Bronze Age collapse. Perhaps it won't be that extreme, but we do see many of the same features that appeared during those eras starting to appear today. So it's what's the Chinese curse about may you live in interesting times? We are there now, or we're headed there.
I see. Mr. Stevens, any final thoughts?
No, not really. I think we've nailed everything well. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you again, Keith, and get acquainted with your thought and how much you've done over these years. It makes me want to go back, look over your books, see what you've been up to, because I know you've been very prolific and you've hit on a lot of really essential things. It's really interesting to me because we've got a group of people here who are trying to figure out, where do we go from here? What's the next stage? And I think implicit in that is recognizing that our current time is in a crisis, even if I think it's more late Athenian than late Roman. But, this has been a great pleasure, and I've really enjoyed this conversation we've had with both of you and the ideas I can throw in.
Likewise.
Excellent. So that was sodomizer Bret Stephens from America.org, Deathnell.org, author of Nihilism, out on Manticore Press. And we had our guest today, Keith Preston, the anarchist extraordinaire, the anarchist who pisses off all the other anarchists, author of many, many books, and the guy who operates the long-running website, attackthesystem.com. Thank you both. Cheers.
Thank you.